So it's Father Dave here from the Darwin MGL mission. I'm currently just hiking through one of the national parks south of Darwin, having a couple of days of prayer and solitude. Now that means that I haven't shaved for a few days, so I hope I don't look too rough on the camera. And also apologies for the jerking. Couldn't quite find something more professional. Yeah, this is a beautiful sort of country, but it's also can be quite harsh and arid. I was reading a quote from Pope Benedict recently when he was beatifying Mary MacKillop. And he talked about how Mary MacKillop worked and traveled through a land that was harsh and arid, both physically but also spiritually, recognizing that the fact that Australia is the driest land, or the driest continent on Earth, next to Antarctica really. Antarctica is probably the driest, another story altogether. But recognizing that spiritually it is just as arid. There is a hardness in the hearts of people here. And this has always been a massive challenge for the church. It's always been a real challenge of how do we take up that call of the gospel, that call to go out and become fishers of men. What does that mean in a place like this? Now, fundamentally, this sort of comes down to this question of what is the gospel? What are we doing as a church? You know, we can see our job as being about just trying to preserve the faith. And a lot of people in Australia have done that for a long time. It was very much that inheritance of the Irish tradition where the faith was something to be defended rather than given. And so for a long time, the church in Australia really just worked on this idea of defense. Let's just protect ourselves, become more like a tribe, and hope that one day everyone else will fall apart and we'll remain. And I think there's still something of that in our church psychology. You still hear this in a lot of the way people talk. How can we preserve ourselves and become the elite or the exclusive people who follow the law of God, and eventually everyone else will follow? But people are starving. People are so thirsty, desperately looking for a word that's going to bring life. And there's something in this thirst where people are looking for imitations. You know, where people have been looking for something that'll satisfy that thirst, even though they know that it's not the real thing. You know, I think if you look at the last, say, 50 years or so of the world's history, you know, we've had this massive movement, this massive revolution, the sexual revolution. And in some way, what people are looking for there it's an imitation of heaven. They're trying to find something which is going to satisfy that deep yearning for eternity, but they know that it won't really satisfy. And we see this when we look at the statistics, you know, and since, you know, over that last 60 years or so, 60, 70 years, the suicide rate in the world has gone up by 5,000%. You know, the rates of mental illness have just skyrocketed. You know, it reminds me so much of that word in the prophet Jeremiah, where it says, "My people have abandoned the source of living water, and they've built for themselves cisterns or water tanks, but they're leaking water tanks. And so they're perpetually dry, they're perpetually thirsting." Now, as a church, I think we can come along and we can just try and do our best. You know, we can sort of present something of the water of life, but really it's not that much. You know, it can seem like to us it's a huge deal, but I think a lot of people sort of get a little bit disappointed. And so in their journey, they come across something of this little creek, and this is what the church presents. You know, we say, here is the water of life, but they say, look guys, really it's just a puddle. You know, compared to the high stimulated, you know, extreme stuff that the world is presenting with addictions and pornography and all this sort of stuff, they say, look, really, is that the best you can offer? It's just a little puddle in the wilderness. And maybe this is the problem. Maybe that as a church, we've sold the message short. You know, Jesus called us to go out and make disciples, to go and bring life to the world, to proclaim not just fire insurance. People often talk about the gospel as an eternal fire insurance. Make sure you end up on the right side of eternity. And maybe that's all we've done. We've said, look, as long as they attend church, that's enough. And so then they stopped attending church. So we said, well, maybe as long as they get baptized, then we'll leave the rest up to God. And well, now they're not getting baptized. So now we say, well, maybe as long as they just believe in God, then maybe that's the benchmark. But maybe there's more. Maybe there is so much more that we need to be presenting to this world. And maybe as a church, we've forgotten it. When Christ says, go and become fishers of men, maybe he wasn't trying to get us to just build an institution or create one tribe that's bigger than the other tribe. Maybe he was trying to get us to actually create a whole new world, a whole new life, a whole new experience of what is God doing amongst us. And I think this is where we've got to broaden our understanding of the gospel. When Jesus poured out his Holy Spirit at Pentecost, he was trying to do something radically new. Where every other religion had been focused about what you've got to do to try and reach God, here was God saying, I'm coming down to touch you. I'm coming to bring heaven to earth. And the life of the gospel is meant to be a life lived in the power of the Holy Spirit. Not a life of puddles in the wilderness, but a life of overflowing grace. A life where families are transformed, a life where you see the ripple effects of this in everybody's society. And so I think this is where, if we can rediscover the gospel ourselves, that's where we're going to rediscover a hunger, a real passion for mission, rediscover the passion for the church. The whole point of the church is we're not trying to build ourselves. You hear the statistics these days and they talk about how, the average age of a person in the church, about 20 years ago, the average age was about 50. Whereas now the average age of a person in the church is about 68. And there's something in those stats which really wake us up to the fact that we're dying, And the church could be dead, well, at least looking very sick in the next generation, unless something dramatic is done. But there's also something else in those stats which concerns me, because it can speak of a mentality that we're in this for ourselves. It's not about having just enough people so we can pay the bills. It's about the fact that people are missing out on glory. And we can't just be providing little puddles of water of life, because the people are desperate. They're looking for something big. And the question is whether you can give that to them. If you had been hiking through a harsh, dry country and you started to hear this sound in the background, my guess is you'd be really excited to hear the sound of flowing water, to suddenly see the change in the vegetation. You realize that this is where the source of life is to be found. When you come across these little places, you can understand why people flock. Tourists go crazy in these places. But there is something, I think, very powerful. There's like an image of the gospel. This is an image that was used so often through the Old Testament, where where God said, I'm going to make the desert flow like a stream. I'm going to bring life out of death. That in the place where it is so dry and so harsh, God is going to be able to bring the source of life. Now that was the promise which was really then fulfilled in the life of the apostles. What God was doing was he was pouring out his Spirit upon a church, upon a people, so that they would be able to go and bring this river of life to the whole world. Now this is where God always mixes up his imagery, because he starts in the Old Testament talking about bringing water out of the desert, But then he starts to talk to the apostles about being fishermen. It's always about water. It's just a slightly different image of water. But I think this is where, to really understand what our role is, how do we bring this source of life to the world, we've got to go up there to the top of this. So let's go for a bit of a walk. There was a modern philosopher who described our part of history as the age of authenticity. He basically said we're living in a stage where people aren't just going to follow what their parents did. In fact, they want to do the complete opposite, because they feel like to be fully alive means to be authentic. I have to be able to shape my own existence. And whatever I do, I've got to be able to back it completely. And I think this is where people look at the church and say, well, you know what, we're really not interested. We don't want to follow a bunch of rules that were created by a bunch of old men years ago. We want to be ourselves. We want to carve our own path. Even, of course, if that means everyone just keeps following each other. But I think it's a real challenge to us as a church. How do we present an authentic gospel? You know, we live in an era where maybe we could describe it as the commercialization of the church. For the first time ever, you know, Christians are making a lot of money through worship. Christians have always sung songs, but we've never made so much money out of it. We've always run churches, but they've never become multi-million-dollar affairs. And people have looked at all this stuff around mega churches and all these gospels that are being proclaimed, and they've just become cynical. Saying, well, where's the authentic gospel? Give us something that we can actually believe in. This is a real challenge for us, because when Christ calls his disciples to go out and proclaim, he also calls them to go into the depths. They're not just proclaiming propaganda. When they're called to be fishers of men, he also calls them to almost become mystics. You know, St. Paul spends several years in the deserts of Arabia just delving into the mystery, trying to understand, what is God doing? How can he find God in the midst of this? And I think this is where an authentic proclamation needs to be very linked to an authentic spirituality, because otherwise you can find yourself just proclaiming more noise. And people don't want noise. There's too much of it already. You know, when Jesus talks about this idea of fishing as evangelization, it is quite a strange image, because the whole idea of fishing is you're pulling the fish out of their natural environment. You're taking them from breathing water to now having to breathe air. And for that fish to go from one world to the other feels like death. And the church has always used that as a bit of an image of conversion. You know, St. Paul talked about baptism as being a bit like a death, but then a resurrection. And I think this is the challenge of mission, is that it's not just about believing in God. It's not just about joining a church or a tribe. It's about changing from one world to another. You know, as I said, you know, when Jesus called the disciples to go out and become fishermen, he was almost calling them to start that journey themselves. They could only become fishers of men if they were prepared to leave one world and enter into the other. And so this is where prayer and mission are always so closely linked. In this age of authenticity, I think people have given up on Christianity because they've seen so many people who proclaim the gospel who haven't left behind the old world. And they say, well, how can I believe your gospel is authentic? Why would I ever want to follow that and become like you? when I see you still living in that dry, arid world, drinking from artificial streams. So this is where the call to mission comes with it, a deep call to personal conversion. In some sense, we leave behind the waterfall. We leave behind that river of life that everyone else is delighting in, so that we can climb the mountain and come to its very source. And once we find that still, peaceful stream, we tap into that. You know, we allow this river of water to flow up in our hearts and ooze out of us. Comes through our preaching, comes through every conversation we ever have. People start to realize that you have become the source of that living water. And they're quite happy to leave behind their world, to go through that journey of discipleship, to join that world that you're in. And there's that famous line by Pope Paul VI, where he says that the mark of true conversion is when the person who has been evangelized goes out to evangelize. And I think that's maybe a bit of a damning comment on the state of the church at the moment, because we've got a lot of people who enjoy doing church. They love talking churchy stuff. They love arguing over whether this person's a heretic or whether this liturgy is being done correctly, but no one's evangelizing. And we'll call that evangelization. We'll say, you know, I'm on mission by trying to defend the church. But that's not what the Pope is talking about. It's easy to sit behind a computer and be angry. It's very hard to try and sit with someone who's just broken and hurting and messed up and trying to be the source of life. Allow the compassion of God that has changed your heart to flow into theirs. That's our calling. When we're meant to go out on mission, to become fishermen, to expect a great catch, expecting that Christ is going to bring people in, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to go out. We've got to set out those nets, because it's impossible to catch fish unless you put a line in the water. Unless you're prepared to throw out that net, you are never going to haul anybody in. Unless you're prepared to be something of that source of life for the world, to open your mouth, to open your heart, no one is ever going to experience that water of life. But this is the point where your heart can overflow and become something of this waterfall, flowing out into that dry land, bringing life not just to the heart of one person, but then into the heart of their spouse, their children, their grandchildren. This is the sort of work that changes generations. If you are prepared to climb the mountain of the Lord, to enter into that place of real encounter with God so that you can discover his heart, then you're going to find that your heart becomes like a net, able to catch people. You know, when Jesus said to Peter, cast your net out to the other side, it was almost like he was saying, you've been trying to do this by your own effort. Do this by my effort. Let your heart be changed. Let your heart be transformed. Open up wide to discover the glory and the love of God, and people will be captured by that. People will be captured by your passion, by your zeal, by the hope that you've discovered. And they'll flock to discover this. I think the final comment I would just try and make here is, don't be afraid to lead. You know, Christ has given you a gift of faith. He has called you into his heart. Don't be afraid to influence people. Don't be afraid to pour out the truth that you've discovered. We've got a world which is just selling people lies. And people are so hungry for something that they're prepared to be lied to. Don't be afraid to lead people into truth. Don't be afraid to lead people into real conversion. Wherever your calling is, whatever vocation God calls you to, realize that your ultimate vocation is to holiness and to sharing the love of Christ with people. So be fishermen. Pull people out of a world of lies, a world of desperation, a world of hurt, and walk the journey with them side by side until they can learn how to breathe in fresh air, how to enter into a world of real hope, of real Christian community, taking them into that journey of discipleship where they can discover a new way of being. And of course, the one final safety comment is don't ever stand at the edge of a cliff next to a waterfall. It really is quite stupid.